Abu Qatada has been a thorn in the side of several British Home Secretaries, owing to a legal wrangle that's lasted more than a decade. And the current Home Secretary, Theresa May, has been forced to admit that the radical Islamist cleric will remain in Britain for many more months to come. Last week, she announced the UK had signed a new treaty with his native Jordan, where he faces charges relating to terrorism. Regularly imprisoned in Britain since he was first detained under anti-terrorism laws in 2002, he has not been prosecuted here for any crime. In January last year, the European Court of Human Rights ruled that Abu Qatada could not be deported to Jordan, as that would be a violation of his right to a fair trial under Article 6 of the European Convention on Human Rights. Mrs May said the new Jordan agreement would include new guarantees that Abu Qatada would get a fair trial.
I believe these guarantees will provide the courts with the assurance that Qatada will not face evidence that might have been obtained by torture in a retrial in Jordan. Before the agreement can come into force and become a formal treaty, it must be ratified by both countries, and the Jordanian government will be laying the draft treaty before its parliament shortly.
But the Shadow Home Secretary, Yvette Cooper, outlined her own reservations.
Today, we are back to legal square one again, going through the deportation process. We want to work with her to make this process work and so that Abu Qatada can be deported as soon as possible. But in the past, the Home Secretary has overstated the evidence, overstated her legal position and overstated her legal strategy, which has not worked. None of us want that to happen again.
It's the latest high-profile extradition case that Theresa May has faced. Last October, she withdrew the extradition order of Gary McKinnon to the United States, where he was wanted on charges of computer hacking. A month later, the Special Immigration Appeals Commission, or SIAC, upheld Abu Qatada's appeal against deportation. So, what should be done about the Abu Qatada case? To discuss this, I'm joined in the studio by John Rentoul. He's the chief political commentator for The Independent on Sunday. Also joining me here is David Coburn. He's chairman of UKIP London. And Fadi Daoud, British extradition lawyer. Get your view first, David Coburn. I mean, do you see there should be an abrogation from the European Convention on Human Rights to get Abu Qatada out?
Well, our position is we should leave the European Union because you cannot get out of the European Human Rights Act unless you've left the European Union. So that's very much our position. I think that we should do whatever we can to get this man out, and I think it's ludicrous that we cannot decide who to keep in our country or who to throw out. I think this is all about the European Union trying to assert European law over British law, and that's not on.
But in lieu of the possibility of Britain exiting the European Union in terms of this particular case, which is going to be rolling out over the next few months, possibly a year, what about an abrogation from the Convention on Human Rights? Would that satisfy you in terms of getting him out?
Well, I think the whole thing's ludicrous because you can't just, use laws against one individual person. We're going to step out of the European Act for this reason, and then we're going to step back in again. It seems it's a rather strange way of interpreting British law. It's not the way we do things in this country.
Fadi Daoud, he's here at considerable cost to the taxpayer. I mean, what's your view on the rights of one man superseding that of the harm done to others due to his preaching?
The difficulty that you've got is this law is being applied across the board to many people. It is not just about Abu Qatada. Abu Qatada is the one that everybody's flagging up. But what's happening is that this law is being applied to many others. The problem is that, yes, it is said that he is a preacher of violence and that he's not somebody who is welcome in this country. But his rights must be protected in the same way that Mr McKinnon's rights are protected when Theresa May turned around and said, actually, we don't think that Mr McKinnon should be going to the US because his rights will be violated. So we've got a situation here where the law applies to everyone. We can't pick and choose how and who it should be applied on. It applies to everyone.
John Rentoul, I mean, what's your view on this idea of somehow suspending Britain from the European Convention on Human Rights? It didn't, certainly nothing concrete was said in the aftermath of what Theresa May, after her address to the Commons. But the very fact that this had currency, that this had media speculation, suggests that it was considered as a real possibility.
I don't think it was, actually, Brendan. I think it was media speculation that for their own political purposes, 10 Downing Street and the Home Office didn't want to knock down, because Theresa May wants to convince us that she's tough on immigration, and it helps her to have the idea of suspending the European Convention on Human Rights in order to get rid of Abu Qatada, have that idea out there. But as Fadi will confirm, suspending the British membership of the or signature to the convention wouldn't actually help in the Abu Qatada case, because that's a ruling by British courts.
But in terms of the fact that she does appear to want to be tough on Abu Qatada, and certainly David Cameron's comments that this case makes his blood boil, certainly I guess if you did a straw poll of people out there among the population, they would want Abu Qatada out. It's important politically for the Conservative Party, isn't it?
Well, all politicians want Abu Qatada out. I mean, it was a source of intense frustration to the previous Labour government that a piece of law that they'd brought in, the Human Rights Act, to incorporate the provisions of the European Convention into British law, seemed to prevent them doing what they felt politicians ought to do. But the problem is, as you suggested there, Brendan, that Britain has signed up to conventions, not just the European Convention on Human Rights, but conventions against torture. And if we mean what we say in those conventions, which is that Britain has nothing to do with torture, we have to abide by those conventions as they're interpreted by British courts, which is that if we send him back to Jordan, he's likely to be tried using evidence obtained by torture. And if we're serious about that, then we can't send him there. And that's the end of it.
Fadi Daoud, I'd just like to get your view. Are you convinced by Jordan's assurances that he would not be tortured?
It's not me whether I'm going to be convinced or not. The SIAC has not been convinced of their assurances. The Court of Appeal has said quite clearly fact-finding is for SIAC. SIAC's turned around and said, we don't trust what the Jordanians have said because, and they were the ones who heard the actual facts. And I've had a chance to read through the judgment again this morning. And, there are lots of experts that came to court. The evidence was heard there. And to just make sweeping sort of suggestions and remarks about this case, it's far too complicated to do and treat in that way. Can I just go back to David's point about that we should be out of Europe and out of ECHR? The problem is going to be this, that there are different layers of law that apply to the UK. This law is incorporated in our law through the Human Rights Act of 1998. So basically it's our domestic law that we're applying. So using sort of David's sound bites doesn't really help on that. If you remove that, then you're going to have to look at what replaces it. What replaces it will be the convention as was prior to the convention coming into force. Then you look at the British courts having to apply the law as they interpret it, having no control over that interpretation of the law. At least now we've got some control over its interpretation. If you then turn around and say, we want to withdraw from ECHR, you've then got to consider whether or not you want to be out of the European Union, because if you can't just pick and choose your law, as soon as you come out of ECHR, the European Union will turn around and say, well, actually, you've got to apply the law according to ECHR. And I'm afraid it's a long answer that you're getting. But even if we do that, which is what David wants to do, then you turn around and say, well, what law would actually apply? Then you would have to consider our law, and that's the common law that would apply. All of these rules that we've had incorporated in ECHR, almost 99.9% came from us, not from anyone else. We're the ones who decided the form that ECHR should take. And all that happened is we'll apply the same rules through the common law.
But just on that point you made earlier about how the Convention on Human Rights has been incorporated into British law in the Human Rights Act.
Yeah.
So that means that the British courts, there's no reason why they can't decide on the Abu Qatada case themselves.
They do decide on it. They just ask Strasbourg for interpretation of how we look at it. It's the British courts who've made that decision. It's the Court of Appeal and also SIAC. SIAC is an animal of statute. It's actually High Court judges who sit. This animal was designed, I don't intend any disrespect to their lordships, designed by the various Home Secretaries. It's part of an Act of Parliament as well. So you can't just turn around and say, oh, we're not applying our law. This is actually our law. Can I just one other point about the common law? Because I think this is where we're going to get at, into a really dangerous situation. And I'm afraid I haven't done this for many, many years. We're talking about an argument in the end between judges and Parliament and supremacy of Parliament. If UKIP gets their way and we're out of Europe, then you're going to have a situation where our laws are applied. And judges will take too much power, perhaps, into their own hands to decide whether or not Act of Parliament should continue or not continue to be applied in this country.
David Coburn, can I get your reaction to some of those points?
I believe we should go back to the supremacy of Parliament. I don't believe that the European Union should have any say whatsoever in our law. I do not think we should be applying to them for interpretation. And I agree with you. We have to be out of the European Union to get rid of the European Convention on Human Rights. Cameron's desperate to stay in at any cost. He doesn't care if we have terrorists or whatever. He won't give us a referendum on it. He doesn't want us to leave. His sidekick, Clegg, wants to be the next Euro Commissioner or something. So I mean, they're not going to do anything about it.
But if we were to drop out of the Convention on Human Rights, we'd be in the company of Belarus. That would hardly be good for.
Well, I think that our very mature democracy, going way back to Magna Carta and all the rest of it, I think we can quite happily invent our own laws as regards human rights. I don't think we have to be told by countries which in living memory were dictatorships how we should how go about these things.
But John Rentoul, it would make it very difficult for William Hague to preach human rights in Zimbabwe or the Third World if something like this went through.
Maybe you should stop doing it.
It would, and that's one reason why it's not going to happen. I mean, the other reason it's not going to happen is the Conservatives don't have a majority in the House of Commons, and I don't think that UKIP would have a majority either. So
don't be too sure. Way things are going, John. Don't be too sure.
But I mean,
wait till the second.
David, I think the idea that somehow, if we were able to frame our own laws, we would be able to throw Qatada out, Abu Qatada out, just because we don't like the look of it.
Well, he shouldn't have been here in the first place, should he?
Well, that's
why was he not removed in the first place?
That may be a complicated argument, but I suspect
doesn't complicate to me.
But
the British public.
No, it doesn't, but it is. I mean, and you have to face up to this. As Fadi said, if we relied on the British common law, we would not want to send people to countries where evidence obtained by torture might be used against them.
And I'm proud, David, I am proud of the fact that I am in a country where we have those protections. It is not about Abu Qatada. You are confusing and conflating a lot of things here with a simple argument about whether you want to be part of the EU or not. I'm here to really discuss the law. I am an animal as a lawyer of the law, and it is application of the law in this country
I have a lot of objections to what goes on exporting Chris Tappan to the United States. I mean, I don't regard America as the font of all law, where you're given an opportunity to plead guilty, or the alternative is 100 years in Sing Sing. I mean, that's not an option.
Oh, well, we're getting.
So I would say the United States is not a safe place.
David, we're having similar rules being applied, I'm afraid, here in the UK, and that's. A lot of it is because of cost cutting, by the way. The courts are applying those sorts of... They're not plea bargains. We don't have that strictly in this country. But it's always tempting for a client to plead guilty in those circumstances. Can I just say this, that you want to make our own laws? Just a couple of things. I just wanted to come out very quickly. You've got a 17-year-old who is in detention. Lawrence and co were involved in that with Just for Kids Law recently, where he was in detention without an appropriate adult. That is... we are members of a UN convention. There was also issues of Article 8 that were considered, and it was considered that it was not right for 17-year-olds to be there in a police station without an appropriate adult. We do not have laws that are perfect. Our laws continually have to change with circumstances. Absolutely. So you have to be very careful that sometimes you do need to have an overview and look at things from outside the country. So you've got the European Court of Human Rights, but you've also got UN conventions, you've got other rules that apply.
Just back on Abu Qatada and the political fallout of this, John Rentoul, I mean, do you think Theresa May will be regretting that she said a year ago she'd be able to get Abu Qatada out of the country very quickly? Following on from that, I mean, what would be the fallout from that? Because there's been a number of mistakes in the way that the case has been handled, certainly from the Conservative side.
As Yvette Cooper said, we are back to square one on Abu Qatada. But I mean, that is not a party political issue, as again I think Yvette Cooper made clear. I mean, both parties want him out, and the procedural difficulties are an embarrassment to both of them. We've been trying to get rid of him from this country for at least 12 years now.
But the opinion seems to be on the side of the public rather than the court. So do you think that the way that the story is being reported, that I suppose the people out in the United Kingdom need to be convinced or persuaded as to being a signatory and upholding the values of the European Convention on Human Rights is to the benefit of Britain?
Well, yeah, I mean, wish you luck with that one. I don't think that's possible. All that Theresa May is trying to achieve here is to make it look as if she isn't totally incompetent. If she can,
doing a very good job.
If she can work work, if she can give the appearance of working steadily towards achieving what everybody wants, which is Abu Qatada out of the country, which may happen if this new treaty can persuade the judges, then Abu Qatada will be out of the country before the next election, and that is all that matters to Theresa May.
What happens when the next Abu Qatada turns up?
She's already chucked Abu Hamza out of the country, and she's kept Gary McKinnon in, and both of those cases she has earned brownie points with public opinion.
Well, I think she'd be better off leaving the European Union, leaving the convention, and save there's a lot of taxpayers' money on all these trials.
Well, I'm afraid
600,000, I believe.
David, as I've tried to explain to you, and as Fadi has tried to explain to you, that is a fantasy. You could withdraw from the European Union, you can withdraw from all extradition arrangements with all other countries, including America, and it would still do you no good at all because the British courts would apply the British law.
Exactly, which means we just change it by statute.
The British common law does not like torture and would prevent you sending people to places
if the Jordanians
where
have given assurances that they will not use such tainted evidence, so therefore that should not be a bar to exporting.
Well, it shouldn't be, and that's the position we've got to now. But we have to still satisfy the courts of that. You can't just decide as
one
UKIP
wonders about our courts and who the judges that Tony Blair's friends have put in charge, and whether we do have a sensible justice in this country.
Today, reporting about the Dubai case, for example, 3 lads who claim to have been tortured, and I've got an extract here if you want to hear it. Grant was separated from his friends. This is what's said as to have happened. Grant was separated from his friends, driven around the desert, beaten, kicked, punched, tasered, and a gun was held to his head. And he was told he was going to die, she said. This is Grant Cameron's mother. They were taken back to their hotel. It does appear they were separated from each other and were taken to different rooms. And then Carl said, Carl was laid out on the bed. His trousers were stripped down and electric shocks were administered to his testicles while he was blindfolded. Is that something that would make you proud that we were sending somebody perhaps to a country where he may be mistreated in that way?
Which country was this?
This is Dubai. This is the UAE.
Dubai is not Jordan. It may be a surprise to you, but Dubai is not Jordan. And not all Arabic countries are behave in the same way.
Well, the point is surely that if you make an exception in one particular case, other countries where there are no treaties or agreements, they will be subject to that kind of torture, that kind of treatment. That can't be good for Britain.
And that's mild for some of the Arab countries.
Well,
and I come from Syria originally.
Well, yes, I've spent a great deal of time in Morocco, which is a quite decent legal system. I don't think that you can equate all Arab countries in the same way. But at the same time, why is this man in this country? If we cannot deport people who is illegally here in the first place, why don't we just deport him to his last port of call, which I believe was Algeria? 100 and something
plus thousand people have died in the uprising that you've had there as well. Come on, David.
Well, we must keep every mass murderer, every rabble rouser in the world allowed to stay in England because we can't return them to their place of origin.
Fadi, can I just get your view on? I mean, we've raised the other case, the case of the 3 in Dubai, but also we know the story of Hisham Muhammad Ali, who's an illegal immigrant, now a convicted drug dealer. He won an appeal against moves by Theresa May to be deported. A lot of critics are saying, well, he abandoned his children, but his right to a family life means that he won't be deported. I mean, how do you feel about that and that particular case and how that fits into adhering to human rights, but probably to the outrage of the majority of the people of Britain?
I'm going to sidestep it slightly to say this, that the point is that the rule of law applies to everyone. And just because you've got a majority that says, well, actually, this guy, we don't want in the country, we'll all vote to have him out, and therefore he should be kicked out. It doesn't matter what the consequences are. That is not the country that we live in. There are consequences to the things that we do. We must protect the whole of our population, and we must protect the whole of our population in equal measure. We cannot pick and choose. And I'm afraid the law applies to everyone, not just me, but David, to John, Mr. Cameron, and others.
But if Britain doesn't adhere to this Convention on Human Rights, why would other countries, that would give them ammunition not to do the same?
Well, there's that argument, but it's also this is a blatant issue here of someone who's come into this country illegally, should not have been here in the first place. He's created a great deal of trouble. He hasn't added to the general charm of the nation. I think it's high time he was exported. He's not a British subject, and I think our laws should be primarily for the benefit of the British subjects, not people who've just arrived in this country and seem to feel that they can behave as they so like.
John Rentoul, what's your view on, is it difficult for British politicians to preach fairness and human rights, for instance, in this particular case, considering that it would be fair to say that the British government has been criticised for human rights issues regarding, say, for instance, extraordinary rendition or prisoners in Guantanamo? I mean, does it throw all that into kind of context, and is it difficult for politicians to deal with?
No, I think the United Kingdom has an extremely good record on human rights since the Northern Ireland issues were dealt with. I mean, Guantanamo Bay is hardly a British government responsibility. British ministers might not have been loud enough in criticising it, but they've been absolutely clear that they're opposed to it and want it closed down, and always have been. And they're opposed to extraordinary rendition and claim to have no part in that as well. So, I think that is one of the important arguments for continuing to be a signatory to the European Convention on Human Rights, is that it does put pressure on regimes like Belarus and Russia to abide by those high moral standards to which they have signed up.
Fadi Daoud, can this kind of case be held up as an example of Britain's insistence that it adheres to human rights and the rule of law?
Absolutely, in a nutshell. I wanted just to come back on a couple of things that David was saying, that the laws should apply to British subjects. If you take Abu Qatada out of the equation just for a second and put another label there, you could put the fact is because it's the them and us argument. You could be a fundamentalist Sikh or a Jew or a Buddhist or a fundamentalist Christian, or a paedophile as an example. If you want to take these two extremes, it is making people feel that is the them and us culture. You have to be very careful that we don't go down that rule, because then it's mob rule and it's not the rule of law.
David Coburn, it's a path towards mob rule.
Absolute nonsense. The average member of the British public knows quite well what the situation is. We do not want people in this country who are coming here to cause trouble, who shouldn't have been here in the first place, who broke the law to come here. We want them removed. If there's an impediment in the Human Rights Act that stops that happening, or the Human Rights Act in itself is an impediment, then we should withdraw from the Human Rights Act. And if that means leaving the European Union, then so be it.
But it is unusual, John Rentoul, for a British Secretary of State to apply to the Supreme Court in this particular way when a lower court had rejected it.
Government ministers are always having to appeal to higher courts against judgments that they don't like. I mean, that is in a sense a backup strategy, because Theresa May doesn't have much chance of overturning the previous verdict that Abu Qatada had to stay. She is relying on this new treaty with Jordan going back to the courts, starting again, as it were, at the beginning of the process to get Abu Qatada out of the country. I mean, the old process the government failed at, and they're not going to overturn that on appeal.
Fadi, let's say that the treaty is approved. Let's say that Abu Qatada does get sent back to Jordan, satisfies all the requirements Britain has. Would there be any checks in place after he was deported to ensure that he was treated fairly?
There's been discussion that there would be checks afterwards, and SIAC was very much of the opinion that he's so high profile that there's not going to be much misbehaviour on the part of the Jordanians once he goes back. So there is that indication. There is only one sticking point, and that is use of statements that are obtained by torture. That is really the sticking point. So as John just said, what Theresa May is trying to do is say, OK, well, if that's the problem, can we have a new agreement? They're not going to use it. If they've got that, then it's fine to go back. The other thing, just so in case speculation about whether Jordan would fail as a state or otherwise, SIAC were quite clear on that. It's not up to us to look into a crystal ball and decide what's going to happen in the future. If it's safe today, that's all we need to worry about.
But John Rentoul, I suppose justice needs to be seen to be done in this particular instance. And, OK, if he is deported and it follows all the legal norms and Britain is satisfied that he will be treated fairly, that's the most important thing. Whether he is actually tortured or not once he gets there is secondary, I suppose.
Well, I mean, there are people like David who don't care whether he's tortured or not, particularly.
Well, I do care very much, but I also don't like the idea of Christopher Tappan being exposed to the United States, which is not particularly civilised in its penal system either. So does that mean we do not deport people to the United States?
Well, it does actually. We don't deport people if they're likely to suffer capital punishment. So
or some of these maximum security prisons, which many people would declare as inhuman. And may I also point out Guantanamo Bay? Americans are very keen to torture people.
Extraordinarily.
So I'd like to. Does that mean we don't export people to the United States? This is nonsense.
Been a judgment on supermax prisons, which is what going
to say extraordinarily, David. Actually, the British courts do not regard the American justice system as akin to torture, and are quite happy to send people.
Well, I think I disagree with that. Over there. But that's just I'm only speaking as a libertarian.
Well, then you're trying to have it both ways, I'm afraid.
There's one other conclusion that maybe would be reached because of your. And I heard the soundbite earlier, and it sounds excellent about not having somebody who's inappropriate.
This is not soundbites.
Who came here in inappropriate seconds. I just want to say one thing. Yeah. Do you really want the UK? Because if we do withdraw from this, all the extradition treaties that we've got as part of the European arrest warrant system, we would be withdrawing from. Do you really want to have petty and some very serious criminals in this country to remain in this country, and that we can't have actually a power to return them back to their countries of origin where they've committed offences relatively quickly using the European arrest warrant system? I mean, it
European
actually
arrest
works.
warrant, I do not agree with the European arrest warrant, where some policeman in some odd European country that's, for the last 60 years has been a communist dictatorship can simply sign a little bit of paper, and as long as that little bit of paper is correctly filled out, like filling out your parking permit for Kensington Town Hall, as long as that's filled in properly, they can have any British subject deported to some hideous jail in Greece or in Albania or goodness knows where else. I really don't think you talk human rights on one hand and you talk about this on the other. You're crazy. The European arrest warrant is an absolute scandal. We all know that.
Well, the reason I mentioned it is because what I was going to say is that these rights, as you've been talking about, have not been applied that often in the last 22 odd years. What has been happening is that this is the basic bottom end of the protections that we have. In reality, we should have better protections than this. And I advocate what you're saying.
I agree,
totally.
we should have better protections, and we should go through the whole thing, and it should be done by the British Parliament, and we should have common sense solutions, then we don't get into this pickle we've got into right now. The reason we're in this pickle at the moment is because politicians, Conservative and Labour, have been doing handstands to try and conform to European law. And that's what it's all about. It's all about the supremacy of European law over British law. And they'll do handstands to stay in the European Union and have these ridiculous laws because they want to retire to a nice, fat salary and a pension in the European Union when they've finished making a mess of this country.
John Rentoul, your reaction to that?
It's just not the case that this is to do with the superiority of European law. You may be surprised, David. I'm a Eurosceptic Blairite. I'm perfectly prepared to consider Britain withdrawing from the European Union for all sorts of reasons. But Britain does not need to give up the European Convention on Human Rights, because that's an important protection. It's very important.
Why can't we produce our own, much more fair, much more logical, which takes into account cases like... Well,
we drafted it in the first place.
Yes, well, when you say we, who do you mean by we? I mean, some of our people decided that the way it is, perhaps it needs to be revisited by people with a little more common sense.
They applied our laws at the time, and they have not changed. And the whole point is, you get rid of it. What will happen, actually, you'll give people more rights if you do in this country. So for me, it'll be a wonderful thing if there was a way of tweaking it.
If Abu Qatada goes back to Jordan before the next election, then everybody, including David Coburn, ought to be content.
Because then any other Abu Qatada pops up, we'll still be doing handstands to conform with European law. It's nonsense.
Yeah, but that's because we don't agree with torture. If you say you don't mind about torture, that's fine. That's one thing. Right. Well, in that case,
consenting adults. Otherwise, I'm totally opposed to torture. Let's get this straight.
No, but David, if you are totally opposed to torture, you are totally opposed to sending Abu Qatada back to Jordan, where evidence obtained by torture might be used against him.
Well, we have to have assurances, unless you consider Jordan to be a complete failed
procedure.
State.
Wonderful. We're all agreed.
No, we're not all agreed at all.
Sadly, gentlemen, we've run out of time. We'll just have to leave it there. Just thank you very much, David Coburn, Chairman of UKIP London, John Rentoul, Chief Political Commentator for The Independent on Sunday, and also joining me here in the studio is Fadi Daoud. He's a British extradition lawyer. Thank you very much for joining me, Brendan Cole, on The Voice of Russia in London.